Hello everybody, welcome to Kavisha Is. The topic that we are going to discuss today is the East Asia Summit. The East Asia Summit took place very recently in the month of November, and the 17th edition of the East Asia Summit took place. We will see in details why this particular topic came into news and why is this particularly important for our prelims as well as mains preparation. We will talk about the whole topic in details. So recently, our Vice President Jagdeep Dhankar addressed the East Asia Summit, and the summit took place in the capital city of Cambodia, Phnom Penh. It was a 3-day summit, and yes, we will obviously have to remember that it took place in Phnom Penh, in the capital city of Cambodia. And we will see what is exactly this East Asia Summit. So basically we all know that there is a Association for Southeast Asian Nations, Asian grouping, and it consists of 10 member nations, and this is particularly the 10 member nations which are from the Southeast Asian communities, and they meet very often and they talk about all the common interest and concerns that comprises in this Southeast Asia region. And one of the initiatives of the Asian grouping is the East Asia Summit. So we will see that there are 10 member nations like Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Myanmar, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Russia, Thailand, and Vietnam. And apart from these 10 member nations, this is the Asian member nations. This map over here can be referred to. And apart from the 10 Asian members, there are several other nations like Australia, China, India, Japan, New Zealand, and Republic of Korea. Now they take part in the Asian groupings as dialogue partners. For example, India has advisory status granted from the ASEAN in 1996. So India also maintains as a dialogue partnership with the Asian member nations. And so we will see that there are many times when India Asian summit take place, or for example Australia Asian member this summits take place, where the particular the dialogue partners can also talk about their own interest, their own concerns in this specific region. So the East Asia Summit is basically a very important initiative for enhancing cooperation among the member nations. So we will see that USA and Russian Federation joined the 6th East Asia Summit in 2011. And we will see that what are the priority areas of ASEAN. Of course, we need to see that ASEAN is a very important grouping in terms of the region it comprises of. It comprises of one of the most growing economies in this region. For example, there is Singapore, there is Malaysia, then India and China and Japan as the dialogue partners, along with USA in the Indo-Pacific region. So this area serves, also Australia is there. So this area serves as a very important region in terms of economy, in terms of population, in terms of trade, in terms of the FDI inflows, in terms of connectivity. So we will see that in 2014, the Asian community, it was the 7th largest in the world in terms of economy and the 3rd largest in Asia. So it's a region with growing economies like Singapore, Malaysia, and very important issues are being discussed in this region. For example, this area also comprises of the most populous countries in the world like India, China. In terms of trade, we can say that India and Asia, like ASEAN, is one of the largest trading partners with India, and it's a highly competitive economic region, the third largest market in the world in 2014. As of 2014, it was the third largest market, and almost 136 billion US dollars FDI inflows took place from this region back in 2014. So obviously this region becomes a very important a place of economic activity, bilateral and trilateral trades, FDI inflows. So of course the priority areas, the talking points, the addressing issues are very important. We will see that what are the main areas that the member nations talk about when it comes to the Southeast Asian communities. For example, environment and energy, of course, there is education, there is finance, there is global health and pandemic issues, there is the natural disaster management, there is the Asian connectivity. We have seen how India, in the recent scenario of the pandemic, India has maintained a very good vaccine diplomacy with so many of the nations of the Southeast Asia. For example, Cambodia, for example, Malaysia, Vietnam. India has delivered huge number of vaccines that were produced in our country, and we have exported it to these regions. India has also maintained a very humanitarian approach towards the smaller nations, for example, Maldives, for example, Malaysia, Myanmar. So, of course, this is a very important region when it comes to economic activity, population, trade, connectivity, everything. We also know that the Sunda Strait, which is in the Java Island region, it that is one of the most important passageways when it comes to the passing of the vessels that pass through this area for the trade. We will see what were the highlights of the meeting, what were the important things that were discussed in this meeting. So the very first important thing is the issues of the Indo-Pacific. This was a highly concerning topic, and this was definitely discussed over there. India emphasized the role of the EAS mechanism in promoting free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. This is very important. We all want the Indo-Pacific to be a region of thriving economic activity, thriving diplomatic activity. So this was obviously discussed because in the Indo-Pacific region, huge growing economies like India, like China, there is the United States of America, and apart from that, there are growing economies like Singapore, Malaysia, and so this is a region which is a highly important region in terms of trade, in terms of diplomatic relations, in terms of the bilateral issues, in terms of the marine ecosystem, in terms of climate change. So of course the Indo-Pacific was definitely discussed. The second most important thing is the issue of the Chinese aggression. So the Chinese aggression that is building tension in this region. We all know that China's increasing expansionism is something that is of concern to US, India, and also other several economies. So this was also another talking point. For example, the Chinese claim over the South China Sea, the Beijing buildings at the artificial islands in South China Sea, then the territorial disputes with Japan in the East China Sea. So these are the talking points which China, which shows that the Chinese expansionism is taking place, and it's very important to talk about the Chinese aggression to maintain peace and security over this region. Then another very important issue that was definitely a talking point was the Russia-Ukraine war and its consequences. So of course directly the Russia-Ukraine war was not discussed, but the consequences of the Russia-Ukraine war that has disrupted the global supply chains, and it has caused food and fuel led inflation, where there is huge price rise, there is huge shortage of fertilizer and several other things that Russia mainly exports to most of the world and this Asian communities, and there is just very much disruption in the supply chains, which has caused the price of so many things to level up. And this is something that is a global issue, so it was definitely a very important thing to talk about. Cambodian leader Hun Sen called for unity, and he said that a spirit of togetherness in upholding open and inclusive multilateralism, pragmatism, and mutual respect in addressing the existential and strategic challenges we all face. So, a spirit of togetherness should thrive in this region. This is what the Cambodian leader Hun Sen he called for. And another important thing is that we all know that 2023 is the International Year of Millets. It's been declared. And so, what is the importance of the Year of Millets? We all know that millets, what are millets? Millets, we can say that the grains like ragi, bajra, jowar, these are very important millets. So what is the importance of millets, and why did our Indian Vice President urge for the contribution of members of the East Asia Summit for the International Year of Millets? Why this was a particularly talking point? Because the millets like bajra, ragi, jowar, these crops are actually uh, these crops, as we know, they grow in the very dry regions of the of India, and also when they grow in other parts of the world, they do not require huge amount of water. They don't require huge amount of irrigation. They can grow in high temperatures. They can grow in low humidity kind of situations. As we know that the world is inching towards food crisis, there is huge climate change issue that is thriving, the increasing sea levels, that is also another talking point. So in this situation, the millets are something that can definitely help in providing economic aid to the farmers. The growth of millets, the growing and the nurturing and the cultivation of millets can help the farmers economically. Other than that, the consumption of millets will also be helpful in such a dire situation. So that is why 2023 has been declared as the year of millets, and our Indian Vice President he definitely talked about all the members of the East Asia Summit to contribute for the International Year of Millets. Then we will see that East Asia links with India. How India has always maintained a very good relationship with the Southeast Asian communities, and we will slightly go back in the past and see what the histories hold. So we know that the Chola dynasty was definitely known for their amazing, impressive navigation skills. So because of their navigation skills, and obviously they had imperialistic ambitions, so we will see that Raja Rajendra Chola in the 11th century, he definitely invaded Sumatra, which is in present day Indonesia, and he had imperialistic ambitions. He wanted to conquer that land, and which is why even today we will see that there are many instances of Hindu gods like Kuber, like goddess Lakshmi, and there are various statues that absolutely resemble the Hindu culture that are seen in the Southeast Asian nations. For example, there are temples in Japan which houses these Japanese version of Kuber, Japanese version of goddess Lakshmi. There is the Indian epic Ramayana, like Kakavin Ramayana. It is the holy book of Indonesia. So we will see that the Hinduism and Buddhism has spread from India and Nepal, and it has spread throughout the Asian subcontinent towards Sri Lanka. We will see that also, Ashoka sent his ambassadors to Sri Lanka for the propagation of his sermons of the principles of the Dhamma. And then in several other nations like Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, Thailand, Japan, Tibet. So in most of the regions, India had built this wonderful connection, and it's not a recent thing. This link has been maintained for many years. So, of course, the Zen philosophy that we talk about in recent times, it's also regarded to be an offshoot of the Mahayana Buddhism. So, as I said, that Ashoka in his third Buddhist council in about 250 BC had dispatched Buddhist missions in Sri Lanka, Burma, and Thailand. So, the propagation of one country's culture in another country's cultural scenario is often called the promotion of soft diplomacy. So, what does this soft diplomacy do? So India's culture, beautiful culture of Hinduism, of Buddhism, which talks about peaceful coexistence, which talks about sharing peace all throughout, and it also talks about acceptance. It talks about unity. It talks about unity in diversity. It's a core message that all Indians believe in their core. So this wonderful message has always spread to the Pan-Asian communities. So this is one of the examples of soft diplomacy. And apart from that, India's engagement with Southeast Asia increased with the Look East policy in the early 1900s, with LPG reforms taking place at the same time around, and the bilateral trade across the borders increased. And when people to people connections increased, uh, the economic ties grew up, and with the Look East policy in the early 1900s, the interaction between India with the South Asian communities had increased after that. We will see that the Look East policy, how it turned to the present policy that India follows since 2014, which is the Act East policy. So the Look East policy was launched in 1991 by then Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, and there was a particular objective that was planned, and the objective was to shift the country's focus from the west to the neighbors of the southeast. So we all know that India, since its independence, was hugely dependent on the United States or the Soviet Union for that matter, for most of its export, for most of its, the economic ties, and so much of, the models of economies were constructed on the ideas of the Soviet or the West. Like people looked towards the West with huge dependency mindset. But slowly, since the 1990s, the Prime Minister Narasimha Rao had adopted the Look East policy, and the Look East policy focused on the East nations, which means these nations. Okay, these nations like Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, these are the regions which lie east of India, so that India can export its own materials to these countries and maintain a beautiful diplomatic relation, strategic relation that will help, that along with the message of peaceful coexistence. So this was the Lookist policy, and the Lookist policy was changed into the slowly the shift was done into 2014 under the Narendra Modi government, and the Lookist policy was changed into the Act East policy, and that was also launched at the East Asia Summit, and this was when the summit was taking place in Myanmar. And in this Act East policy, the government relied on three C's, which is culture, connectivity, and commerce. Three things: culture, connectivity, and commerce. Three C's to develop better connections with the Asian nations. So, definitely, we talked about the promotion of Indian culture in those regions, in the east, southeast communities, and then increasing connectivity. For example, there are many there is this particular multimodal project called Kaladan multimodal project, which India, it's taking place between India and Myanmar. There is a port in Myanmar called the Sitwe port, and the Sitwe port is connected to the Kolkata port, and this particular project is known as Kaladan multimodal project. So this is one of the examples of the connectivity. Also commerce, like India, Myanmar, Thailand, there is a trilateral highway that is taking place. So these are the possible ways in which Act East policy is being implemented by the present government. And next we will see that what are the objectives of Act East policy. So we will see that India acts east. So with its Act East policy, India hopes to deepen its political, economic, and security relationships with the Southeast Asian members, and balancing against the rise of China is a key driver, because we all know how China is maintaining its expansionist and imperialist policies, and we have seen in recent times how the Chinese the China is constructing several kind of like humongous projects in Sri Lanka and in other nations also, and how these other nations have suffered huge losses, and they could not pay the due to China, and which is why China has conquered these projects. For example, in recent times, we have seen the situation of Sri Lanka. Uh, all its projects, they could not repay the debt, and so China has conquered most of these settlements and the ports of this region. We have seen how Sri Lanka in recent times have been badly engrossed in huge debt. Their forex reserves have been depleted, and how this is one of the ways in which Chinese expansionism is working. So in order to uh, balance this rise of China, India is definitely building these strategic relationships with the neighboring nations of the Southeast. And other nations like Japan, the key region power, shares India's concerns over Chinese expansionism. Now, most of these countries, whether it's Australia, whether it's Japan, whether it's South Korea, they also have very strategic and very like positive relationships with India, and they are also somehow very positive, partners of India in maintaining this relationships, this for the flourishing of the economic ties and for also the security reasons. So we will see that the economic cooperation is one of the main objectives of the Act East policy, so that several this regional, bilateral and multilateral agreements could be fulfilled. There are examples of some free trade agreements that India is having with several of these Southeast Asian nations. There is also another partnership, another agreement which is known as the Comprehensive Economic Cooperative Agreement CECA, and India is also taking part in many of these bilateral, trilateral, and multilateral agreements. And increasing interaction with the Northeast nations, that is also another thing. We all know that the Northeast nations, the Northeast states of India, for example, this Arunachal Pradesh and this there is Nagaland and Arunachal Pradesh. These regions are very close to the Tibet border, the China border, and China is also maintaining some. It's making some infrastructural projects and human settlements in the border region, and that is also seen as a situation of threat. And how India is maintaining a very good relationship with the neighboring countries of Myanmar and other this Thailand and Cambodia, so that when the time comes, it can ask for help, it can ask for, it can make a very conjointed effort against Chinese expansionist policies. And then finding alternatives to traditional business partners, for example, US and Russia, in the wake of new geopolitical atmosphere. As we all know, in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine war, we need to find alternative business partners with respect to the traditional business partners that has been in the situation for many decades now. For example, very recently, a US ambassador said that India does not need to be an ally of the United States. Rather, India is emerging as a very individual superpower on itself, which is independent on its own, and many other small countries are actually depending on India. Small or even bigger countries are actually maintaining strategic relationships with India in the present global scenario. So these were the important things. So mainly the Act East policy is very important for curbing the Chinese imperialist state, and this was all with regards to the Asian grouping and the East Asia Summit. Thank you. That's all.